This is Felipe, Lakefeperd, Danaluz. My respect for this guy is off the charts, and that's where his game should be. He's the creator of the Spark the Electric Jester series, a trilogy of high-speed action platformers which draw inspiration from Sonic, Kirby, Metal Gear, Mega Man X, and more anime than I can shake a stick at. I have an adoration for each entry, with 3 being my favourite game of last year, and the most fun I've had with a 3D platformer in some time. It is seriously overlooked. And while I might not be able to get them on the charts, I can at least chart the growth of them and their creator. And to do that, we gotta begin in the before times. Lake actually got his start in Flash animation, influenced by Super Mario Bros. Z. Unfortunately, I can't show you any of his works from this time because he made these when he was a teenager and was lucky enough to be able to destroy them. I can relate. He swiftly swapped to a more macro media with fan games, releasing Sonic Before the sequel in 2011, and with this Lake did as Sonic would and hit the ground running. Before immediately got a lot of attention, and some fascinating connections are created in this period. Lake made 3 fan games using Sonic Worlds, an engine built on top of Click Team Fusion meant for simplifying the design process. This is the same base used for Freedom Planet, and a lot of the code for Sonic Worlds is by a guy called Damazine. A lot of the same names pop up here and there, and Damazine seems like a relatively little-known figure outside of the scene who has contributed a ton to it over the years, helping with coding for 2D and 3D Sonic projects on top of his own work with Worlds. One of the early 3D fan engines even came from him carrying on a project started by Christian Whitehead years before he went on to do the ports and Mania. The Sonic community is often the butt of jokes, but there are some real bright sparks in there, and it's cool seeing all these people coming up at around the same time from near enough the same starting point. Spurred on by passion, creating for fun, or just wanting a good game when the Sonic series wasn't giving them what they wanted. While Sonic Mania is the most famous thing to come out of this space, and I understand why, Freedom Planet and especially Spark deserve a look in. Though, like any good Sonic title, we've got 3 acts to clear first. Sonic Before the sequel is an okay first entry. It plays it fairly safe with only a few stages really gripping me, one of them being the Lost Levels zone, riffing on Sonic 2's storied cut content and interpreting how these stages might have played. But even this early on, we do see Lake iterating upon Sonic in small ways of his own, and many of these changes do hold water. He does a lot more with weather effects and lighting to make his stages more interesting to look at and give them a sense of progression. Gameplay-wise, he tackles unpopular, contentious, or awkward mechanics and tries to fine-tune them to better fit his idea of Sonic's gameplay. See his take on the Slicer, a hated enemy in 2, here he has kept their attack pattern an essential character while making them far less unfair. They're not in bad nick. I also enjoy how it swaps characters between each zone. There's novelty in that this may be the first time I've played stages tailored for Tails. And speaking of Tails, as its name suggests, it takes place between Sonics 1 and 2 and tells the story of how these two met. Lake used his experience of animation to add cutscenes, which being Flash cause hell nowadays, and are a little rough besides, often as wooden as 1/3 of the Lost Levels. While visually not much to write home about, I really do like the tone. Lighthearted with occasional slapstick. Lake makes great use of what sprites he has to work with to convey a simple yet expressive story with no dialogue. It got a few smiles out of me. Before the sequel wound up impressing a guy named Falcao Young, who contacted Lake about composing an original score for Before. Lake was down, so a team was put together, and in 2012, it was re-released with an OST that even got Jun Senyu's attention. Many of these names have gone on to pretty big projects, and most relevantly to this, Falk went on to do the mastering for Mania. I, for the most part, like the music. A few tracks are a little clunky, and Sunset Star Act 2 may be the oddest composition I've ever heard for a Sonic stage. They got some brass balls, haven't they? Sonic after the sequel followed in June 2013, and unlike Blast is a blast to play through. Taking heavy inspiration from Heroes, though we won't hold that against it, basically every zone is trying out something a little different, and I love the way these levels flow. They're more gimmick and obstacle heavy than traditional 2D Sonic, with mastery over the current gimmick being the way to hidden goods and higher routes. Sonic's movement is still important, but de-emphasized because of this, so if you're a bit of a purist, this may not gel with you. Stages can get a little repetitive, but tended to end just as I felt an obstacle had run its course. Though perhaps my favourite idea was one of its simplest, coming in Sugar Splash Zone Act 3. Every once in a while, water will rush through the level, disrupting jumps and throwing you into hazards. First time around, I hated this, but on a revisit I learned to jump in time with the flooding to get me out of jams into higher ground. This is sink or swim, a deceptively clever obstacle that a skilled player can turn to their advantage. Lake is also iterating rapidly in his own ways. He's putting way more of his own art into the mix. His own badniks are well designed with sharp timing and clear, readable tells. He's further experimenting with telling story through level design. I love Tails flying the tornado in the background of the opening act. Set to KGZ's The Adventure Continues, it's such an exciting way to kick things off. It has so much confidence, and time and again after the sequel proves itself worthy of this opening bombast. And in this track, the hero's influence is made clear with Seaside Hill riffs. And on that note, the music has also drastically improved, better matching the ebb and flow of stages and better matching Sonic music, while still letting the artists maintain their own identity and tackle an eclectic mix of genres. I would thoroughly recommend giving After the Sequel a go if you're into Sonic, though part of what's so interesting about it is that it's very much a collage. Many gimmicks and elements are taken from other platformers and made to work well with Sonic. Though it is buggy. If you think you'll actually beat After, you might want to hold your breath. Besides the fact I couldn't get cutscenes working on this one period, which is a shame because much like everything else they've come on leaps and bounds, I had a glitch where I kept drowning during the penultimate battle as Super Sonic. It's such a shame because the credit zone looks really charming. As you make your way through, you're treated to zone trivia delivered by Lake and the music team, listing their intentions and influences, which is a really charming peek behind the curtain. Lastly, we have Sonic Chrono Adventure. Now, I'm not a fan of Metroidvanias, but that's okay, because this is actually a Metronic game, which it turns out I'm also not so hot on. This is Lake's most story-oriented work so far, and it's disorienting. The plot is simple yet slapdash and confusingly told. It's as if Sonic is chasing after the plot and only getting the tail end of it. Not to mention that guy is nowhere to be seen. It's also my least favourite to play. The stage is roughly as flat as the narrative, and the gimmicks don't escalate so much as they just repeat. The Metronic-style abilities are fun to toy with, but cumbersome to use. There is cute sprite work, and Lake is making further stabs at reimagining what 2D Sonic can do, but not even the boost can turn this into a rush. All of the music is reused or sampled from elsewhere, though this is where my criticism has to end, because there's a reason for all of this. Chrono Adventure came out just 6 months after the sequel, and Lake started working on Chrono because he made After in 10 months, and the music team couldn't keep up with him. Oh, and Chrono was an expansion for a demo he made. During this time, Lake is also drawing up prototypes of Spark while still a game design student. Sonic 1 was born out of an ideal that players would speedrun it. Well, it seems like Lake took that attitude to game making. And all the more impressive is how much he develops between titles in every sense of the word. Before the sequel is iterative, while there are some original ideas, it is for the most part playing with what's in the toy box and only layering on things here and there. There's a reason Lost Level Zone stuck out to me. It is a fun level on its own merits, but a good deal of joy came from being in on the bit. Lake was very sharp about this. He knew he didn't yet have much to work with in terms of skill, so his method of getting eyes on his work came in the framing, setting a game between 1 and 2 as a means to get people interested, while also letting him start in familiar territory. Come after the sequel and he starts sharpening up his own level design and starts adding elements not seen in the Sonic series along with more of his own assets. Fan service is no longer top priority, still not wholly original, but undeniably more experimental. This game feels like Lake fully turning over every mechanic and examining them from all angles so that he knows better how to use them later. Chrono adds entire new features on top of the classic formula. Health bars, shops, inventory, an overworld, and abilities, some of which modify the controls and physics. Now instead of threading story between games and tying them to canon, Lake is adding his own characters and world building, along with dialogue. While I don't care for Chrono's design, I do respect it. Stages had to be built to be navigable in both directions. Lake had put upon himself a whole new set of difficulties and very quickly adapted to match them, even adding a helper character in somewhat graceful fashion. I would also argue that if you are new to Sonic games, Chrono's relatively low difficulty, health point system, and more relaxed pace with player-driven exploration makes for an okay starting point. It's amazing how much more expansive the guy gets with each and every entry, never resting on his laurels, always willing to throw something new into the megamix. I'd even posit these games are a prime argument for the value of fanworks as a learning tool. While fan games tend to not get as much flack, I'd say we tend to look down on fanworks. I'm guilty of that too, and I'll continue to be every day I see a Danganronpa project on Casting Call Club, especially when they don't take me on. But there's nothing wrong with using fan works to learn a craft. Writers can learn using established voices. Fan animations, films, and art can draw on iconography. Fan games have a base of character abilities and general design. In all these cases, you can learn by seeing and reinterpreting how these things work and then develop your own style and approach. When Lake made before the sequel, he had zero programming skills of his own. He made what he could with the tools and expertise he had, and in so doing learned he wanted to make games for a living. So he grew and adapted with a base to build from, helped by a community of people around him which further allowed him to expand his skill set, and especially with free fan games, you get to go wild and try things the real license holders might balk at, like a Metronic game. With each entry, we see Lake step out of Sonic's shadow. He was also planning a Shadow Cross Kill la Kill fan game, which he canned. Maybe this is why people take the mick out of fan stuff. I say, looking at something that was no doubt being made with a wink and a smile. Anyway, after all this, Lake was ready to get started on his own projects. After he killed Shadow la Kill, he had two choices, either working on his F-Zero inspired racer, or Spark, with the platformer ultimately pulling ahead. The spark for Spark first came about during After the sequel, with a Kirby-inspired power-up which gave Sonic a new move. Lake wondered what a character based around this mashup would really entail, and he mocked up a few designs but could never quite find something others would like. Funnily enough, it wasn't until Andy Tunstall, one of the musicians who worked with Lake, reworked his earliest draft that the design clicked. Lake put it that he had it right on the first try, it just needed to be refined by a better artist. A sort of return to formy. I'll be referring to this art book here and there, and this whole thing is hosted on Imager. It's funny how with such a simple character design, it can swing so wildly. I find this one adorable, but the expressions are really hit and miss. This one worries me. I feel like Spark has just learned about crypto and is about to put his powers to the worst use possible. I've talked with friends who are way more artistically minded than me, and they find Spark's character design too flat and simplistic. I think it works great in motion, what with the scarf and jester hat, but I am rather easy to please. With the title's emphasis on transformations, it also serves as a simple base to modify. The Sonic, Kirby, and Rystar influences are clear, while the final character still has at least a little bit of a look of his own. And Spark's character portraits in the game itself are consistently charming. Luckily, he got off the blockchain in time for these. Lake spent a year refining a demo and laying the groundwork in development before launching a Kickstarter in 2015, billing Spark as a mix of Mega Man X, Sonic, and Kirby Superstar. That's a fun pack. While funding was crucial to development, the Kickstarter was largely ran so Lake could pay his music team this time around, so he seems like a sound guy. Unlike his Sonic games, Spark took a while. Originally slated for a 2016 release, which slipped into 2017. I don't mean this as a slight. This was a commercial release, the scope of the project far larger, and this was now an original IP. And of course the extra time and polish really shows. That said, it had a rough start. The game was made on XP and had a lot of technical issues for people on more modern systems, and while patched up, it remains patchy for players even to this day. Not to mention, there weren't many players to begin with. Lake mentions how one issue with moving away from fan games is that unless you have a really distinctive style for people to latch onto, very little of your old audience will follow. I and many others only came to learn that Spark 1 existed because Spark 2 made the rounds by being an adventure-ish platformer. And I'll admit, the only reason I played Spark 1 was to get to 2. I went in expecting not much more than a novelty, but I'm ecstatic that I did. And that's because Spark 1 became what may be my favourite 2D platformer. We begin with Spark telling us his bizarre life story. He studied electrical engineering at university, and in his spare time made a jester hat which allows him to manipulate electricity with his fingers. Upon graduating, he learned that electricians had been replaced by robots. What a tragedy. Luckily, he's a man of many hats, and with his he became a street performer before getting picked up by the circus, only for a robot replica of him to steal his job before his first paycheck. Unable to afford rent, Spark is worried. Don't worry, Spark. After the last video, we're all concerned by this setup. But no need to fret. Spark may be out of a job, but this intro really works. It's such a jam-packed series of coincidences and contrivances to explain Spark's abilities and situation. An electrician suffering robo-redundancy who's athletic enough to join the circus, who had built a powerful jester hat which let him toy with electricity. It's a hell of an arc. Even the title is bizarre. The only other time I think you'd even see the words Spark the Electric Jester strung together is a party clown getting the electric chair. It all comes across like a tongue-in-cheek take on Mascot platformers in a typically contrived construction by taking it to an extreme. It's silly, but then played totally straight, and the rest of the game has the conviction to carry this off. By the end, I'm totally invested in this bizarre setup carried purely on the sheer sense of fun and excitement it all leads to. It pokes fun at the absurdity of this kind of game, but also gets why it's done and why it's fun. As a name, Spark the Electric Jester even comes across as a fairly succinct riff on the Ringmaster. Sonic is often portrayed as a drifter, never staying in one place for too long. Spark drifts between jobs, though a lot less willingly. Sonic is associated with wind, Spark with electricity. Both are names and motifs which suggest speed. And obviously to cap this all off, we got a robot doppelganger, which for now will be played for gags. This is all very playful, so let's get to playing. Spark spots some robots going rampant, and with nothing better to do, our recently sacked star springs into action. And we're off! Stage 1 hits us out of the gate with green grass and rolling hills, set to a Mega Drive bass so thick that the genesis of this game seems unmistakable. But if you're expecting Spark to play just like Sonic, you're in for a shock. The first few seconds of control are a very deft little demonstration of its differences. 2 short jumps to get a feel for the gravity, then 2 health capsules because instead of rings, we got a health system, and this shows us what to look for. Rings have been replaced by bits. These very slowly fill up a bar which gives you a free revive. It's a neat replacement for the live system, keeping some of the tension and providing exciting second wins. Spark is a tough game, but between this, infinite lives otherwise, and constant checkpoints, it's also rather forgiving. This leads into a small speed segment to demonstrate that momentum is still a factor. The first enemy then is placed in a way where you need to confront it. Spark is a far more mechanically complex game than Sonic, with a far greater focus on combat. Most enemies don't deal contact damage, instead you and foes need to actively attack. I have to give props not only for the sheer amount of enemies in this game, but for how well done they are. There's just one enemy in the whole game who felt unfair to fight, and they're on the last level. For the most part, they put up an enjoyable scrap before becoming such, with good tells, surprisingly varied movesets, and new arrivals level by level. Spark himself is no slouch either. Besides normal attacks, he has air attacks, directional attacks, charge attacks, and by filling the static meter, you can unleash devastating supers. And what with needing to hold down the attack, there is a little bit of tension to it, like you're carrying this big attack to where you need it. Beyond that first foe, the path diverts, and this is where Spark also diverts from Sonic, in that navigating through levels is less about movement and more about moveset. Spark has wall jumps for added vertical mobility, and instead of a spin dash we got a dash. But there's still a spin to it. The dash is a good way to quickly get speed from a standstill, instantly change direction, and can be used to run up inclines. So far so straightforward, but it does have a knack to it. There are situations, especially downslopes, where it can be used to get a ton of acceleration, but maintaining speed is about skillfully navigating the environment without it, as it will bring you back to a set speed. You have to be careful when and where you use it if you want to keep up the pace. I can sum up the controls and physics like this. Spark is more complex, but less nuanced than Sonic. He's more complex in that he's got way more of a toolkit of moves to learn, and those moves have subtleties which make their use satisfying or let you get a bit more juice out of them. But he's far less nuanced than Sonic in that Sonic is very much about learning how to get the most out of the few moves he has using the environment. Spark allows the player to brute force where they want to go, where Sonic would need to finesse a jump. Momentum still does help a player get an edge, or an edgy as we'll soon see, but only occasionally. It's like the foundational physics this game are built on top of are almost vestigial. So if you're all about that classic momentum-based platforming, you're not going to get everything you're after. And I should say, I'm not bringing up these differences as a criticism of one or the other. I'm going to be doing a few more Sonic comparisons as this video goes along, as the influence does remain, and there are some interesting similarities and divergences. But I also want to point out now that we're here, I don't think you need to be a fan of Sonic or Kirby or Megaman to enjoy Spark. It has enough going for it to stand alone. Spotting the influences is just a fun bonus if you're also a fan of those series. I will also say that being a Sonic fan who hasn't put his time in with Mega Man or Kirby, I can't spot those references and can only come at this series from a Sonic lens, which is a bit of a disservice to it. I'll link to a VOD of a mate of mine who's played way more games and can spot those references. Anyway, on our way out of the first area, look who drops in. The two have a bizarre little back and forth, insults are thrown, the hero's short fuse is blown, and he decides that robot apocalypse or not, his only goal in life now is sparking this guy out. It's good to have a direction in life. And being a Sonic-esque game, that's the right direction. This brings us to the Network Coast. This level is an early game favourite, it's amazing. It's almost a 2D Metal Harbor with a great balance of speed and water sections. The music is energetic, the background is gorgeous, and there are robot pirates. We've talked Sonic, so now let's tackle the Kirby influence. Spark's abilities are anything but static. The guy's a transformer. Dotted throughout the stage and occasionally hidden away are Jester powers. You carry 2 at a time and they can only be lost if knocked out of you or dropped. And these things are no laughing matter. They may not even be matter. More than just power-ups or suits with some extra abilities, many of these feel like totally distinct playable characters. I'd even argue a good number of them could carry games by themselves. Some have air dashes, some double jump, some have up and down moves, some have light combo systems, some have ammo. They all have different attacks and some completely mix up the charge mechanic, like when filled they give you a movement boost, infinite ammo, or a shield. Some change how you interact with water. Yeah, this is why Network Coast is a great balance of speed and water sections. Bored of the water? Bored on the water. This game gets it. And it doesn't end there. Edgy lets you run up walls. Wind completely changes your physics. There's also cute stuff like them having unique animations for looking up and down and so on. There's just so much here and it's of such good quality. Now, this does come with what could be called a downside. Spark is a jester, not a tightrope walker. Balance hardly feels like it was even a consideration. Sure, some are more tuned for platforming and others bosses, some give you ranged options at the cost of mobility or vice versa, but there are also clear best options. Hey, what do you think would be the boss killer? Fire powers? A magic wand? How about a simple electric bat? Yeah, no wonder robots took over the job market. The people here can't even spell. Still, this thing is the strongest power bar none. You just jump, spin, and everything's dead. Meanwhile, Wind and to a lesser extent Edgy just blow out the platforming sections and can more than hold their own in boss fights. Spark gets hard as it goes along, but if you grab Wind and Bat, which are basically the first powers you come across, they'll take you as far as you need to go. I mean, look at this. I can ignore platforming if I so choose. Meanwhile, Gravity brings new meaning to Let Sparks Fly, though this is balanced out by being unbelievably boring to use. An unconventional approach to nerfing, but one which works really well on me. And this brings us to something I skillfully avoided earlier. The dash isn't just a dash. It's also a dodge. If you've watched me for a while, you know I love cool dodges, and this one's a winner. Its timing and effects both lend to it feeling endlessly rewarding to pull off. And it's forgiving enough to get a grip on, but it's tight enough not to trivialize stages. And it's sick how you have to dodge into things. It's such a cocky move. It makes a lot of the enemies and bosses far more fun to fight, lets you pull risky moves to style through the stage, and on the harder modes, mastering it is more or less a necessity. I do have a couple of gripes, though the first one is pretty much in line with the game's irreverent tone. You're only told about the dodge mechanic in a cutscene before the hard mode. Aren't you a cheeky little bugger? Secondly, it makes any Jester power which lacks an air dash feel incredibly restrictive. No amount of power quite compares with the ability to dodge at any time. As the game goes on, the stronger powers do seem to get trickier to come across, and this is good and bad. Good because it makes them more valuable, and losing them more daunting and tense. Bad because the only way to lose them is to trade them off or have them knocked out of you, which is rare. It can discourage experimentation, as it could be a long while before you get your favourite back again. There are only a couple of powers I dislike, and I tend to play with a self-imposed rule to swap out as often as I can to vary up a playthrough and keep things fresh, but play as you like. For a player who's struggling, who needs those stronger powers, it can be a real kick in the teeth to lose them, and it can discourage swapping out to try something different if you feel you're dependent on it. I bring these issues up because I know they exist, but the game gets around them by having all but a couple of powers be really fun to use. And even in those powers I don't like, there is none of Chrono's clunkiness. Everything is smooth, and everything is workable. I just adore the powers in this game. I love how stuffed each of them are, so unbalanced yet never falling on their face, each more or less a full character. Another thing that goes a long way in making them all feel so complete is in how so many of them have little tricks and subtleties which are completely surplus to requirement. Some I didn't pick up on for a good few playthroughs, or only learned when I saw friends use them. Now you can pause the game and read the hints, but that comes with risks. Like how Fire Jester gains a dash attack. The hoverboard's attack gives some air. Wind makes you so light your heavy attacks have recoil. Fire doesn't fully work underwater. Arrow's down attack can double as a way to extend jumps. There's so many little touches and Easter eggs and my head is spinning. My favourite little trick belongs to Hammer. The down attack creates debris, which can be swatted to give it a ranged attack. These are way better than the swords. And speaking of blue balls, there was meant to be a cutscene in this stage explaining that despite there being a global robot rampage, these robot pirates have nothing to do with that. They're just doing what robot pirates do. I choose to believe that's still canon. The network coast takes us from one shore to another, and we enter the Smog City sewers. The following 3 levels form a trilogy of sorts, from sewers to skyscrapers. First we traverse up from the trash-burning sewers, defeating its samurai robot. You're right, Spark. From there we tackle the smog-filled lower city, then up into the corporate sunset heights high above the pollution. This sequence is a treat visually and musically, and the progression between them is so smooth. The sewer track is mysterious and pondering, perfect for puzzling your way through the place. Smog City is energetic and lively, the bustling lower section of a metropolis. The music once again slows down as we climb free of the fumes, letting us breathe a little easier in Sunset Heights with a killer track from Funk Fiction. I love how these 3 stages swap to a more vertical focus to tie them all together. It follows Spark as he chases his lookalike to the top of the city. Or well, it's meant to feel like that. I'm kinda just going with the flow here. The gameplay also lowers its tempo, as we go back into more platform-heavy challenges. Up until near endgame, Spark tends to follow this rhythm of alternating calm track to exciting track, which does help keep the game from feeling stagnant. But I do find the level design itself to be one of the relatively weaker elements, especially in the first half, with stages feeling segmented and overlong, many taking 8 to 10 minutes to clear. While levels do feel different enough in their individual elements and general navigation, they follow a beat-by-beat layout where the game snaps between speed, platforming, gimmick, and combat areas. It particularly hurts speed sections, as at their worst they wind up feeling like set pieces or cutscenes with minimal interactivity, the game reminding you that speed exists, getting you good and wired, and then grinding to a halt as it changes focus. Where Sonic would let you often use speed to trick your way into another area, here they're too often just bridges between different challenges, with perhaps 1 or 2 jumps to change lanes. The speed all too often lacks its own function, which makes it feel perfunctory. I will say that the game massively improves in the back half, with stages getting more daring and mixing elements more and more. But Spark is a decently long 2D platformer at 4 to 5 hours. It's unfortunate that a game with so much running takes so long to find its stride. This wasn't really an issue the first time I played. In fact, it worked to the game's benefit. The first half let me really toy around and play with powers. Then in the back half, it felt like I was being tested on all that I had learned. But on repeat playthroughs, the first leg of the game can make me feel impatient, like I'm waiting to get to the fireworks factory. The level design sits somewhere between After and Chrono, but tragically this is an element that doesn't really feel like a next step or a big advancement. It's not as compact as After, and in my opinion nowhere near as interesting or experimental, but it's also nowhere near as flat as Chrono, perhaps saved by the fact that Spark works far better with these kind of flat grounds, which feel like a waste when Sonic is there because Sonic literally needs stuff to bounce off of. The approach to gimmicks is different, but also feels distinctly between the two. There are bespoke level gimmicks, but they lack the presence from After, and it's a lot of the same kind of gimmick. These tend to give Spark greater upward mobility, and all that changes is the means by which you manipulate it. What's actually more interesting are the obstacles not tied to specific stages, though this is another thing which makes Spark take a while to really take off. These are introduced slowly, seemingly 1 per stage from level 7 onwards. At their best, the stages mix tons of elements into fun challenges the player has a variety of ways to overcome through the Jester powers, with stage hazards adding complications to combat, speed letting a player smoothly bypass spots, and gimmicks rewarding an attentive and skilled player with goodies and new routes. It's cool, but another thing which leads to Spark feeling more than a little bit backloaded. Though speaking of routes, at times navigating to higher paths is dependent on having certain powers, with lower mobility jesters often completely locked out. This is an element of balancing that actually functions. It may seem odd, but I'm in favour of this. It makes the mobility feel more meaningful, reminds me a little of Sonic 3 and K, and it's especially satisfying if you can finagle your way up with something you clearly shouldn't be able to. Overall, the stages are mostly fine. I wish a few were chopped down by a couple of minutes in length and did more mixing of their elements early on, but it picks up as it goes. And it's worth praising that they don't fall apart or feel completely overshadowed given the variety of Jester powers they all have to accommodate. At the top of the city, Spark once again comes face to face with his fake. This time, rather than taunting Spark, he instead begs him to go home, that this isn't his job. It's a pretty different tact from last time. Spark doesn't get it. I do really like the dialogue here, with Spark in over his head but not even caring. He doesn't stand down, a fight ensues, and Spark hijacks a transport to continue his pursuit. Before crash landing, he settles on a name for his robot double. Oh, your eye didn't like the joke there, Spark. And we're dropped in Litoria Bay, a hologram-based amusement park. This level gives me pretty big Sonic CD vibes, and despite any gripes I just shared, this game still has way better level design than CD. Actually, this is where the upswing in level design quality begins. It also has my favourite enemy in the game. The security here will put a smile on your face and a hole in your chest. And because it reminds me of CD, let's talk about the music. I mean, you've been hearing it. This whole soundtrack is a winner. Before and after were both amazing, but listening back after Spark, they somehow feel stifled by their attachment to Sonic. With a fresh new world in which to flex their muscles, they've made such a strong setlist. I heard it best described as a homage that's unique in an interview with Fark, which is a pretty good summation of Spark in general. Every stage track not only perfectly fits its environment, the music adds a genuine sense of depth and character to the stages. The eclecticism makes Spark's world feel alive and exciting. To top it off, I complain that the stages often outstayed their welcome, but the music never did. It's incredible too, considering the number of musicians involved in such a relatively small-scale project, that the end result is not only so well done, but feels so cohesive. The Sonic influence is felt early on, then it diverts and starts fleshing out a new world. Where the earlier soundtracks referenced riffs from official Sonic games, now references to their work on before and after are slotted in here. It's a fun celebration of what got them to this point, while being worth celebrating in its own right. At the other end of the park, we run into its mascot, the holographic jester robot Romolo. Okay, actually we ran into him earlier in Smog City. He pretended to steal our wallet, and for that, Jape, we're taking his life for real. This brings me to boss fights. Let's start with the most important thing. There are a ton of them, with a good number of stages featuring multiple mid-bosses and all but one ending with a climactic battle. This doesn't start all that positive. Up until Romolo, the battles are often so trivial I'm worried the bosses are running on energy saver mode. It's this little mascot with his interesting patterns and second phase that promises there's excitement to come. And it's with the following stage I want to point out what I really love about the bosses, and it's where the Megaman influence is at its most prominent. We run afoul of the Forest Guardian Karana, and their moveset is clearly the Archer Jester we've been able to use up until this point. A good number of enemies and bosses are based off of Jester powers. To start with, it's a fun world-building detail. Jester powers are things used for hobbies and work. It seems Spark isn't the only one out of a job thanks to this job lot of jobbers. Gameplay-wise, I love rival fights, and this creates a lot of them. Plus it rewards the player's own knowledge, as barring a few attacks unique to the bosses, they tend to have a lot of the same moves the players do. Then the stage ends with this. This is where the boss fights really take off. From here, the standard of bosses is kept high, often rich in challenge and spectacle. This is where the foes go from jobbers to needing the player to put the work in. And it's really fun. Good patterns, satisfying to counter. It maintains some of the rhythm of Sonic bosses, heavy on movement, waiting for openings to punish and allowing a daring player to take risks to get more hits in, while also leaving room for Spark's greater complexity, with good use of Jester powers and mastery of the dodge, letting a player really go all out. Boss defeated, our platform crash lands out in the desert, and Spark is confronted by the Forest Guardian. Only now, she isn't hostile, but Spark is less thrown by the sudden turn, and more struck by the question as to whether robots can have genders. Luckily, he decides to think about that on his own time, so we can start the second coolest level in the game. This is a speed stage, built for the board, landmines to outrun, DK barrel set pieces, and power fluid. It's a thrill ride through and through. So while I have this exciting footage to hold you hostage, it's time I tell you about the lore of Spark. Oh, I've been antsy to get to this. So Spark is actually a Formi, which is an interplanetary insect species, and they fled their own home centuries ago due to some sort of crisis. There's a reason this place is called the Murray Desert, and that's because we're in the Sea of Tranquility. You may have noticed a strange planet during the stages taking place at night. That's Earth. This game takes place on the moon. Spark's species have settled in our solar system, terraforming, anti-terraforming, terraforming. They've done up the joint. So where's humanity? Well, we're playing Milky Way musical chairs because no one knows. Nor do we know the reason why we left. And as of now, no, the series has not gone into where we've gone. I actually don't care if it ever does. I wonder if the mines in this stage are ours. Planting mines on the moon seems like the sort of thing we'd do. I rather like this backstory. It's strange, but it does create a perfect little platformer reality. The moon setting is a fun reason for the lowered gravity, and what with the terraforming, well, it turns out there's some literal world building going on. One of my favourite details is there are company logos chiseled into the landscapes, and we can see signage for these companies when we head through Sunset Heights. There's an absolutely unnecessary level of cohesion for a platformer setting, and I find it really charming. The stages, while bizarrely laid out, all make some kind of internal sense and tell their own story of the world, with themes of industry, pollution, fear of automation, and most fittingly for a dev who got his start in fan games, an ongoing wind crisis. And that isn't just fluff, that's an oddly diegetic reason for a great many of the stage hazards. That big ring encircling the planet, that's actually for climate control. And while I'm on the topic of their industry, it took me way too long to notice that a unifying design element for many of the robots was that they had faces resembling a typical Formi. Well, they're beta designs anyway, which is odd. It is still a nice little design flourish. I suppose it is natural to anthropomorphize. Back to the moon thing, what do Formies call the planet? Well, they don't have a name for it. Okay, actually, that's not quite right. The problem is, they have too many. Formies are born fully able to communicate, and so the concept of foreign languages is foreign to them. So when they unearthed all of our data and realized we had many names for the moon, they had no earthly idea what to call it. This is utter lunacy, and I love it. And while this is just me Sonic spitballing, I do wonder if it's riffing on the odd split between Sonic's world being either Mobius or Earth. It would be a weird joke to make. I don't even think Yes could make a more roundabout riff than that if they tried, but it's pretty fun to think about. And at the end of the level, we meet a very confused robot. He's the intended guardian of Megarath, a giant computer meant for production of high-quality robots. Upon hearing this, Spark puts together that that must be the source of the uprising, and it seems this robot will make a fine ally, but the news that Megarath was finished years earlier causes him to turn. Spark's cool with it, but I'm not sure he understands why they're upset. What follows is a very easy boss fight, and this is for a rather unique reason. As shortly after Spark's victory, we find our former foe in the clutches of Freon, begging for life. He's cruelly destroyed. This scene does move the plot along by giving Spark an actual objective, which is good because he's been running blind for an entire day now, but this scene also serves a bizarre meta purpose. This robot is called the Prototype. His easy defeat and subsequent destruction by the villain is because he was the original final boss design, scrapped both developmentally and now literally, as Lake came to find him utterly unimposing, and used this moment to make fun of himself for such a lame design. That's a really fun gag. It's such a strange, humble, weird way to go about this. It's the kind of bit you only ever really get in a one-man band project. So, now that Spark finally has a goal, and I've covered a great many of the major topics, let's pick up the speed. The following level is Lunar Base, a chance to relax after Moray Desert. No enemies, just pure platforming challenges that at least initially you can take at your own pace. I at first thought the somber music was because of the death of the Prototype and to give this stage a more contemplative tone, but now knowing that this is a human installation and we're all gone, it's a rather melancholy place overall. It also does a lot with lava, playing more like a Sonic After the Sequel stage, exploring a singular gimmick in full. This also caps off a fascination with remixing underwater mechanics which flowed through each of the earlier fan games. The level itself culminates with a series of timed under-lava sections where special checkpoints grant Spark a temporary heat shield. A pulse-pounding scenario in and of itself, the consequences for failure terrifying. I always feel an urge to speed through these as quick as I can, just intrinsically and extrinsically. And this does come with a benefit of carrying the shield into other platforming challenges. It's a good incentive and reward for speedy play, really lighting a fire under your ass. It's a clever segment overall. And then we surface in Karia Valley. This stage is stunning. Literally, what with the interplanetary flashbang going off in the distance. And because this is an area of outstanding unnatural beauty, they're building a shopping mall here. Naturally. Okay, Karia Valley is absurd. It's a tourist destination, a spaceport, and where the military is stationed. Yeah, when that mall is done, it's going to make for a bizarre bazaar. One neat detail about this stage is how it has lava. It's a pretty minor obstacle, but it's cool how it ties itself to the previous stage like that, making them feel interconnected. And this brings me to the unique strengths of Spark 1 overall. This first title is heads and shoulders above its sequels in 3 respects. The Jester powers are at their best. I like the soundtrack by far the most, and we've gone into why, but this also ties into what I'm about to say. This game feels like a journey, and this is achieved by a Sonic freestyle flow between levels, the sense of place each location provides, and the outstanding use of background art and continued, slightly subtler use of weather effects. Karia Valley, for instance, grows more smoggy as we make our way towards the city and train station. A sandstorm starts raging in the desert, or the lights going out in Litoria Bay. Network Coast is awesome. As you begin the stage, you can see the coast of FM City, the previous level, and as you make it near the end, Smog City starts creeping in the distance. While I knock the level design being repetitive and overlong, the locales often develop and change as you progress. This keeps the levels from feeling like treadmills, and besides being nice and dynamic, is encouraging the player that they're on the right track. On a macro scale, there's things like the time of day consistently and believably changing level by level. And this brings me to the funniest part of the art book, this extract. As you may have been noticing, Spark has been moving northwards throughout his journey towards Megarath, as evidenced by the fact you're always moving right while facing west, and you always see the sunset. No, Lake, I didn't notice that. I appreciate the detail, and I appreciate the unearned respect I'm getting. Well, despite my inattentiveness, Lake's visual storytelling is wonderfully done here, and contributes to the sense that we're on some big adventure through a setting brimming with possibility. Karia Valley transitions through several locales, and ends with us boarding a military train, and well, here's the thing. The entire moon is one nation. There hasn't been a war for centuries, so the army has been wrecked by the robots. But that ain't gonna stop Spark, and we depart in Turbulence Plains, which actually has my favourite backdrop in the entire game. I'm a big fan, and so I don't just blow through this stage, it has one of my favourite level hazards, dodging trains, which again ties it back into the previous level. And we go through a military derelict on the way to the apex of this game's wind theme, the Reynolds Complex, which sees us navigate our way through the guts of a giant wind plant. This stage is every wind gimmick rocking you like a hurricane, a fast-paced puzzle stage where suction tubes and reaction times will decide your path. And as we reach the plateau, we get some of the toughest platforming so far as we have to start fighting the game's physics to progress. It's a great stage and a bit of an equalizer, as even the stronger powers start feeling reined in by the challenges faced here. And this is followed by a stage that I'm not terribly fond of, the game's one dud perhaps. The Megaman computer generates so much heat that it has to be built in a cold region for cooling, and so we head into the snowy Sunfire Forest. It's literally a sequel to Litoria. The music and visuals do continue to charm, I love the atmosphere, but it does feel out of place. Both because we've already done this gimmick, and a level this laid back and upbeat in theme so close to the end of the game does stick out a little awkwardly. Plus, while Litoria Bay reminded me of Sonic CD for positive reasons, this time it's laden with pinball gimmicks and some fairly dry platforming. It's one of the weaker stages overall, though not without its merits. You could see it as one last chance to breathe before we fully embrace the endgame, and its ultimate challenge definitely suggests that. We come to the Tower of Eos, a boss rush laid out for Spark, but not by the villains. On its roof we face Romolo yet again, and when defeated, he apologizes for his past actions, and takes Spark to see the Doctor. Transported to a room filled with former foes, Spark thinks it's a trap. But then, the ugliest thing I've ever seen gets on screen, and gives us a big dollop of plot. This is Dr. Armstrong, the roboticist behind Megaman. Deciding it needed a guardian, he built the robot now calling itself Freon, who went rogue and kicked off the robot rebellion. He now sits in Megaman, accumulating power which Armstrong fears will soon be put to terrible use. I've gone very light on plot up until now, but that's because there really hasn't been much to speak of. It's mostly filled with Spark having strange conversations with robots, before a boss fight kicks off because their programming means they have to fight. Meanwhile, Fark starts off confrontational before revealing a genuine concern for Spark, urging him to back down, his earlier aggression merely an attempt at scaring him off for his own safety. There's an absurd nonchalance to the dialogue which I rather enjoy, carried by how likeable I find Spark. He's a bit of a moron. His mind wanders off on odd tangents. He laughs at his own jokes, is really stubborn in some regards, really laid back in others, and despite his circumstances, harbours no ill will towards robots besides Fark, which is a really endearing quality. He's friendly, thin-skinned, and thick-headed. Spark has a likeable story, but it's not well told. Often meandering, and on my first couple of playthroughs I would often forget why Spark is doing any of this. His vendetta against Fark and plans to counter the uprising are told to the audience, but so flatly that they hardly register. It's easy to just forget what's actually happening. Though the strangest thing about the story is that it wasn't always like this. It was completely rewritten in a patch, and it may be the oddest rewrite I've ever seen, because rather than adding clarity to the story, it does the opposite. The older version is much easier to follow. Spark's motivations are far more readily established and reinforced. He's often given direction so the player understands why they're going where they're going. The details of the world aren't just subtext, but text box text. Each scene feels necessary to the plot and adds details to the ongoing conflict. It's not only easier to follow, but it tells the player more. But all of this comes with a strange trade-off. It's also a lot less likable. The dialogue is clunkier and the gags grating. Spark himself is a completely different character, much more intelligent, yet arrogant and standoffish. Rewritten Spark seems to barely understand the robot uprising. He just doesn't like it and springs into action out of some innate goodness, I suppose? And a grudge not against robot kind, but just the one who aped and japed him. All the while never thinking about the bigger picture and hardly seeming to grasp what's really happening. The older version comprehends the scope of what's going on and doubts there's any chance of stopping it. He just wants to spark Fark before all goes dark. Armstrong sicks him on Freon, yet Spark only agrees to go along with the plan if Fark is in the way. I find old Spark interesting, an obsessive cynic who only saves the day because it enables his petty revenge, doing pretty much everything else on a whim. But I prefer the rewritten dumb as brick Spark, empty-headed instead of single-minded. Both versions act before they think, and I like that. Impatience is a fun flaw for a speed freak. Anyway, why the rewrite? Well, it's because of Spark 2. The sequel is going to delve a lot deeper into the robot uprising, and many of its new reveals would contradict Spark 1. So upon release of the sequel, the story was gutted, essentially. All of the same scenes exist, what story is there takes just as long to be told, but with a majority of plot details excised so it wouldn't be at odds with the sequel. The problem is that it doesn't offer new details or introduce a new angle. It just has no one question or explain what's going on, instead doing bizarre little skits along the way. For an example, before the rewrite, Fark was built by Armstrong to get close to Freon and take him out, but since he wasn't connected to the internet, the means by which Freon spread his virus, he was quickly found out. In the update, Fark's origins and goals are just left up in the air. Armstrong believes he was trying to take out Freom and failed, but doesn't even speculate why. This is so the sequel has a hook to swing from. It's a bit sloppy, and I can't think of any other game that has done something like this. Despite all of that, just on the back of its oddball charisma, and because the series is going somewhere with all of this, I prefer the rewrite. This is a case where I'll take daft and charming over competent yet obnoxious, though I wish there was more of a middle ground, as it does wind up making the origin of the series feel a lot like aimless filler. Anyway, back to current events. Fark tried to take out Freom, but lacked the jewels for it, and Armstrong tells Spark his actions have been criminal, which, whoops, what are they going to charge him with? Assault and battery? They'd have to take him to a circuit court. But Armstrong promises to take care of all the legal guff and offers Spark a job. He's so happy. And job's a good un. We have to take down Freom, and that begins with the best level in the game. Mega-Rav Fleet. High above the surface, the military is locked in a losing battle with Freom's forces. Spark is dropped behind enemy lines to infiltrate and blow up 3 of the ships, each of them filled with hordes of enemies and harrowing hazards. It's an exhilarating premise and is executed perfectly. Who ordered an electrician? Across each ship, the challenge ratchets up as we take on boss fights, disable weapons, and overcome what feels like an army of automatons. I absolutely love every aspect of this level. Just thinking about it wakes me up. And that music. This track was composed by Fault. Lake's instruction was the very helpful, do whatever you want. This worked fine, because it turns out what Falk wanted to do was make the most awesome track imaginable. Being a JRPG guy, he describes it as a final dungeon, only going at 200 kilometers an hour, and it contributes to the metric ton of fun we're having here. This stage also has something really, really funny in it. Or not, I don't know. In the distance, you can often see the next ship you'll be tackling, along with a raging space battle. Lake says he programmed it so the battle will play out organically, with ships getting destroyed and the sky gradually clearing. Only he set the health value so high, he doesn't actually know if this feature works. Not exactly ship shape, is it? It's a good thing this stage is brilliant, Lake, otherwise I might stop and actually look instead of enjoying myself. This stage is rad. It overcomes every single level design issue I feel the game suffers from. While still segmented, it's done in a way that suits the environment and feels distinct. Challenges intermingle and thread through one another. Each ship swaps up elements while escalating the challenge, culminating with us confronting Fark, furious we're here and unflinching in his mission. What follows is an amazing fight, if an absolute cast iron bugger first time around, as you have no time to pick up on his tells. It gets really satisfying to figure him out, dodge his blows, and punish. It's a great test of skill no matter what powers you've brought. Powers which you are very likely to lose. It's awesome. It basically forces a rival fight organically. Or inorganically. And then, Phase 2. I mean, that's basically a bat. Fark knows what's OP. And I die. Or not. Perfect timing. Phase 3. I don't know how many ways to say this stage just puts a smile on my face. With Fark's defeat and the fleet defanged, we fall back to the surface and launch an assault on Mega-Rav itself. While the scenario is less exciting and it lacks the bombast of the fleet, it's still a brilliant sequence and sufficiently daunting final stage. With the red earth hung in the background and gimmicks themselves taken from Death Egg, this final stage truly is cracked. An onslaught of relentless robots and disorienting dangers, the one badly made enemy in the game. If these are the robots Mega-Rav will help create, I'm only happy to pull the plug. These final 2 stages make a brilliant capstone, taking a good few lives on my first time through and challenging every skill I had learned. The final stage is so bafflingly overstuffed that it looks unfair, but is actually very doable, and the satisfaction of winning is well rewarded. We get a delightfully hammy scene with Freon, as he announces his plan to launch Megarath as a rocket into the planet's ring, killing all organic life on the surface. His line's taunting and dripping with evil. It's really indulgent. He takes off, and Spark bolts after him. A confrontation ensues on top of Megarath's outer shell. Spark fights Freon to a standstill, and sick to death of the Jester, he goes for the juggler. And it's then that we swap to Fark, and hey, he has unique moves. And all we do with him is move to the right, and he makes a last-minute save. One final sequence, one last great use of background art. I just love everything about this. We fly up the side of Megarath as it leaves the atmosphere. Between the cutscenes and what's going on now, there's a crudeness to the presentation that does not get in the way of selling how hype what's going on is. This crudeness actually contributes to the feeling of boundless imagination that gives the game its charm, giving it an easier time getting right into a sense of childish glee as Spark flies off for one final showdown. This feeling holds into the final battle. It doesn't give Freon many new moves, nor increase the difficulty. If you beat his earlier form, now you get to do it again with an overpowered moveset. This makes for a tepid final boss, but pretty amazing victory lap, set to an amazing backdrop and a killer score. Lake excels at finales. I think, ironically, they most remind me of his earliest listed inspiration, Super Mario Bros. Z. It's a goofy Flash cartoon with a premise that seems impossible to take seriously, but if you move beyond that and buy into the spectacle, it will speak to whatever childish joy you have left, throwing action figures at one another with no shame nor sense of an upper limit for how crazy things can get. His endings all have an energy that make everything that came before, no matter how good they were, no matter how crazy or extreme, feel like Lake was holding himself back all along. And now the dam has burst and everything turns up to 11. And with Freon defeated and Spark now employed, he cleans his clock and clocks off. I've gone through this sequence time and time again, and it never fails to perk me up. From the amateurish yet expressive cutscene, the comedically over-the-top size of the beam, the moment of calm, then the absolute whiplash of the music, with a lineup of all the enemies in the game. It's so humble an ending, as between the enemy lineup we see Spark returning to Earth. And that's the game. I got it expecting a novelty, and got japed into playing one of the sickest titles of all time. And we're still not quite done yet. This game is rather stuffed. Fark's story opens a month later, with Spark absent and Fark crashing at his place. He's bitter that he failed to carry out the purpose he was built for, but with the robot still rampaging, Fark knows that Freon is still out there somewhere, and sets off to put a stop to him. It's a rather light setup, getting the player back into the action as quickly as possible. Fark himself is a joy to play, no jester powers, but with far more bells and widgets than Spark. Unique attack strings, finishers charged by a free-hit combo, air dashes, wall running. He's a dynamo. A mixture of various Jester powers to form a singular, complex, and complete character. But his own unique power is the most enjoyable. Instead of a dodge, he gets a parry. It's a really meaty mechanic. Depending on how well your timing goes, it can merely deflect damage, deflect and grant some static, or deflect, grant static, and an opening. And this parry doesn't mess around. Enemy attacks? Twat. Fan blades? Hot air. Trains? On strike. Robot mind virus? McAfee. This is how you build static. Fark has less health, but when you fill half a bar, it can be traded for a heal and a temporary power-up. Hold on to this until full charge and boom! Fupa Fark. This should be rewarding, and it can be, but god is static easy to build and exploitable thanks to stage hazards. This is meant to be the harder route, at least it comes across that way, but with a little patience, it's almost trivial. The remix levels and Fark's somewhat unique abilities do make for a fun playthrough, one that I'm unsure if I enjoy more than playing as Spark himself. It goes to show the game isn't dependent on variety of movesets to be worthwhile. It remains fun even as a set challenge. It's the exact same set of levels, only with tougher enemies and some new routes Fark is funneled down. Lake has even remixed some of the bosses and added new ones. And, I think it's fair to say the tone is different. Story-wise, this is a strange, hallucinatory beast. It starts off reading like little more than an excuse mocked up so we have any reason to play as Fark going through the same set of levels. And then it awkwardly lurches into trying to be more than that, but not by much. Fark is likeable enough. He's a mixture of elements from Metal Sonic, Shadow, Meta Knight, and Zero, a rival character, and one with enough going on to turn over in my head a few times, even before the later titles properly flesh him out. A robot built with a singular purpose who has it stolen away by the one he was built to imitate. A headstrong hero who doesn't really understand what's going on, doesn't care, and just dives into the fray. Pushing aside Fark's attempts to get him to stop and ultimately doing what he was unable to, despite that being his sole purpose. Being a month old, with no set personality beyond what his mission required, his failure leaves him adrift, frustrated and unsure of who or what he's meant to be. I love the irony that he stole Spark's job, only for Spark to unwittingly do the same to him. Karmic justice from a formic jester. It can't be said the game is devoid of good subtext. This is a really funny underlining. Plus, it's a comedic spin on the rival dynamic typical in Sonic games. Ironically enough, Sonic and Spark are both rather static characters. They're both self-assured and don't change much, but through their actions inspire others to grow. With Sonic, it's through his good nature and heroism. Meanwhile, Spark is just an almost one-track twat who just wants to drive his boot up Fark's ass, which gives Fark a boot drive filled with self-doubt. And in the aftermath of all this, Fark gives himself his own boot up the arse. I'd like to say I did extrapolate this from the game, but then the artbook just says a lot of this outright. So I'd say for all of the clunkiness, this story can convey what it needs to. As the story goes along, it culminates with the reveal that Freon's destruction turned him into a decentralized consciousness, his virus no less potent. The new bosses we've faced are him fighting for control of Fark's mind. These bosses are joined by a really cool new track by Andy Tunstall. It's the only song in the game with lyrics, and taps directly into the part of me that loves Crush 40. It's a perfect fit for this scenario, and the fact it had lyrics alone worked to show Fark as the more introspective and troubled character. And this gives us the strength to see Freon and Fark's self-doubts off, Fark endeavouring to find his own purpose in life. For all of my praise and how much I do enjoy Fark in theory, in practice, this plot just doesn't have enough going on for the big thematic statement to land. Fark pushing Freon out of his mind, declaring that since Freon gets in the way of people fulfilling their own purpose and dreams, he must be stopped. It's a good time, but it clearly wanted for a bit more depth than it could manage. The story ends with Spark saying this story sounds wild, and they should talk more. Might not be a bad idea. Spark is a maximalist platformer, throwing so many ideas in at once that it should not work, but it gets by on relentless momentum and confidence, even as it lacks Sonic's own momentum. The gameplay is unbalanced yet joyful, the story gutsy yet gutted. The world is two-dimensional with depth. It wears its every influence on its sleeve, and my word, is it well tailored. This is my favourite 2D platformer. More so than any Sonic game. I like it more than 1, 3 and K, and Mania. It's 4 hours long on a good run, and I wish it was a little cut down, but the end of the journey always satisfies. It's a game where I have a lot of gripes with it, with issues that are easy to point to, but always overshadowed by how much fun I have with it regardless. Sega used to have a slogan which went, "To be this good takes ages." Well, Lake done it in 1. This may be one of the most pleasant surprises I've ever experienced. So, let's move on to the game that japed me into playing this one. Hey everyone. This is the first third of what's meant to be a full Spark series retrospective. The sections 4 parts 2 and 3 are scripted, narrated, and the audio is done. They just need the video edited. I'm going to be releasing them one a month, and hopefully that will give me some time to get work done on Yakuza 6 without me disappearing for the better part of a year. Again. Because I promised only one Spark video, I'm only going to charge patrons once for the supercut, and I really appreciate the patience that I'm always shown. If you want to toss me a tip, I've got a Ko-Fi, so you can reward me for my own poor-ass planning and overestimation of my abilities. This was a pretty short-sighted mistake. I was really enthusiastic about the Spark series when I started this project. I still am, but I figured I was so deep into it for the moment that a Spark series video seemed easy in my head, back when I started in January. And I figured that enthusiasm would lead to a quick, easy, yet somehow decent script. I figured I'd have everything good to go in February, and then I could spend the next few months battening down the hatches to long-haul a Yakuza 6 video. Then I fell into a Lakefeperd rabbit hole, not just replaying the games, but reading up on the stories, whatever tidbits of dev I could get, playing the fan games, and slowly realizing I was in so much deeper than I had intended to be. I've had a good year in my personal life, but have suffered professionally. My productivity has gone way down, and I wish I could find balance. I started the year off with a goal of playing 1 new game a day to expand my horizons. Play one at least for an hour. That fell apart within the first month. I also intended to spend 1 day on YouTube projects and 1 day on personal projects and alternate between them so I could have some screenplays and that going. That fell apart within the first 2 weeks. I'm not a man of schedule, and I'm a weird workaholic. I just start working at some point during the day and struggle to stop to do something else unless a friend is involved, and as is like, oh, I feel bad I haven't released a YouTube video in so long, let's drop the personal projects and record and write and do this and do that. I visited America for the first time in February, and I may do again in the fall. I was put up by a bunch of mates in New York City, and I loved my time over there. One of the best weeks of my life. Funny thing, I have batophobia, fear of tall buildings. A week going in and out of Midtown essentially fixed a phobia that I've had since childhood. Just funny enough, it was at the 9/11 memorial, and I was drunk, and I was just kind of there, and I had my hood up, as I always had, and I just kind of looked around and realized, oh, this is having no effect on me anymore, and then next day I was back out in Midtown again, and I was like, can I walk around without my hood down to kind of obscure the buildings? And I couldn't. I could walk around. It was amazing. It was this weird moment, and a very weird place to have that personal realization. But when I got back home, besides the absolutely horrendous jet lag that just laid me out, I learned just how much I work on momentum, and so many lines and ideas I had for the Spark video, I couldn't quite recapture the tone I was going for, the jokes I was going to make, and I didn't refine all of them. Once the tiredness subsided, I was trying to refine my place, and I was kind of getting there. I was getting bits and pieces back and finding how I wanted to approach the games, how I wanted to cover them, how I wanted to talk, the important parts, the unimportant bits I could skip over or skim over, and how to put things. And then I got the flu. A really horrible one. And that put me out for another week. So there were a few interruptions. I hope these don't feel like excuses. And I hope this first portion has entertained. This isn't a genre I cover often. It's awkward for what feels like a bit of a comeback after being gone for, 5 months? Feeling like I've stepped out of my comfort zone to do so, but hey. The next 2 games are definitely way more in my wheelhouse, and I hope you'll give Spark 1 a look. And I hope one day I'll figure out my balance. Have a good day, and I can confidently say I will see you next month with Spark 2.